spend a lot of time going through the detail because there is much detail. You see, as we read through that, there also seems to be not just a lot of detail, but a lot of repetition. And as we study this and as we understand this, I think when we, hopefully as we're working our way through, and certainly, hopefully by the time we come to an end, we'll understand the significance of these offerings, particularly in the context of the New Testament. As we started off our study, we made the point that I believe is evident from what we've read so far in the book of Leviticus. In these offerings and these sacrifices, that there can be no proper worship, there can be no proper relationship with God without the proper sacrifice. And that's why God was so specific in making sure that people understood exactly what He wanted. As we discussed many times, God gave specific and minute detail about the design of His tabernacle. He gave a lot of details about how the tabernacle was constructed. And He says, the reason I've designed this and the reason I want you to build this is because this is where I'm going to meet you. I want to have a relationship with you. I want to live right in your midst. And so after he gives the design and the method of construction, after God gave the gift to the builders, God imparted to them a knowledge and a wisdom and ability that they didn't have before to build these magnificent things that He designed. But after it was built, then He says, all right, now you've got the place, this is what you're going to have to do. And He lays out 5 specific sacrifices that we've talked about. So far we've talked about the burnt offering, we've talked about the grain offering or the meal offering. Last time we talked about what's called the fellowship or the peace offering. And this time we're going to talk about the sin offering and the guilt offering. They all have a lot of significance. One of the things I want to point out is that they are all significant in a unique way. They all have a unique meaning to them. But what I gleaned and what you probably are remembering from what we studied before is that when these offerings were presented, they're not always presented in the same order that we have in the book of Leviticus. In other words, we don't always start off with the burnt offering, then go to the grain offering, then the fellowship, the peace offering, then the sin offering, the guilt offering. In fact, I was reading ahead of the book of Numbers, and it's repeated quite frequently that when the offerings took place, there would be the combination of the burnt offering and the sin offering and the fellowship offering. Those 3 in particular were mentioned. I think that's significant because what we're going to see about these offerings is, again, they have to do with the sacrifice of Christ, and in particular, what the sacrifice of Christ was intended to do for us. And we'll get into that in more detail. Now, this time, we're going to talk specifically about chapter 4 and 5, the sin offering and the guilt offering. But before we leave that, remember the last time, at the very end of chapter 3, when we studied the law of the peace offering and the fellowship offering, the last sentence there says, "It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You shall not eat any fat or any blood." And we talked about the significance of that. Again, why was the command given that the children of Israel would not eat any blood?
The life is in the blood.
Because the life is in the blood. The children of Israel said that they were not to eat any blood of any animal because the life of that animal is in the blood, and if you ate that animal's blood, you basically took on its life. So you were lowering yourself to a lower form of life. Remind us again, what is the significance of the edict that they should not eat any fat?
Well, the scripture says that all the fat is the Lord's.
All the fat is the Lord's. Symbolizing what? What does fat symbolize?
Excess.
Yeah, it symbolizes prosperity or abundance. And there's a lot of Christ symbolized in this because we know that when Christ came, he basically contramanded these 2 commands, didn't he? Because he says, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. So Christ was the one who brought back to us the prosperity and the abundance. And also Christ said something that troubled many of his followers when he said, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. So Jesus was telling the people to do something that the Old Testament scriptures had forbidden them from doing. But when Jesus said, drink my blood, he's saying what? Take on my life. My life is in the blood. Therefore, you drink my blood symbolically. You take on my life. And that's exactly what He wanted us to do. So again, we have a lot of foreshadowing in that simple phrase there. Don't eat any fat, don't eat any blood. Why? Because that's saved for the fulfillment of Christ. He's the one who's going to give that to us. He's going to give us the abundance and the prosperity. He's going to give us his life. Yes, sir?
It said to be confusing to them, because aren't they still living the Old Testament? And Christ comes in, this is New Testament.
That's right. And Christ, that's right. Like the commercial says, this changes everything, and it really did. And that's why some of the Jews resisted to the very end. You know, at Paul's time and Peter's time, you had that resistance. Well, if they said in order to be a Christian, first you got to be a good Jew. You got to obey all of the Old Testament laws. And Paul kept saying, no, don't do that. This is something entirely new. The command still holds about don't eat any fat of animals or any blood, but symbolically Christ is saying, yes, now it's time that you take on, you eat my flesh, you drink my blood, and you receive the prosperity, the abundance that only I can give to you. And it's not prosperity and abundance in material things, it's the abundance of life, right? It's everlasting life, it's eternal life that Christ wants us to have in the now.
Well, the problem, they still think of him as a good teacher.
Yeah, and he certainly was a good teacher, but that certainly isn't the end of it.
Do you think this might also have been to help them have healthy guidelines for food and stuff too?
I think it was. I think much of this had a dual purpose. We're going to read later on in Leviticus about the cleanliness laws and what things would make somebody unclean. And yes, I think that the cleanliness laws had to do with physical health. And why was that? Well, specifically because the Jews were serving as the womb of the Messiah, and God wanted them to be pure and clean and free of diseases for that purpose. So yeah, that does have a multi-purpose, if you will. Now, on the law of sin offering, as you read through this, did you see anything unique or different about the sin offering that is not included with any of the other offerings? If you don't remember, we're gonna hit on it as we get to it. As we left off last week, Tommy asked a very interesting and thought-provoking question. The sin offering, it starts off by dealing with, it says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, this is chapter 4, verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded to be done and commits any of them, and then it goes on. But the idea was, if anybody commits an unintentional sin, I think the King James Version says, if they sin through ignorance. And so Tommy says, what does that mean, to sin through ignorance, or what is an unintentional sin? That's a very valid point, particularly when we compare the sin offering to the guilt offering. And I'll ask you this question to kind of focus our minds on the distinction. Am I a sinner because I've committed a sin, or do I commit sin because I'm a sinner? You say, has he finally lost it? Am I a sinner because I commit sin, or do I commit sin because I'm a sinner?
I'd say the second one,
I think that's right. And why is that?
because
Perfect.
you don't know.
We're all born
You
in
did,
sin.
you didn't know.
Conceived
We're all,
in sin.
what's that?
Conceived in sin.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly the point of this. And I think that, if you will, that distinction helps us to understand the difference between chapter 4, the law of the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Because what we're going to see in chapter 4 in the sin offering is that there's something very unique and different about the offering or the sacrifice related to the sin offering. And I think a lot of it relates to exactly what Tommy said. The dealing with the so-called unintentional sin, or the sin through ignorance, is really an acknowledgement of what you just said, a sin nature. That I'm not a sinner because I sin, I commit sins because I'm a sinner. My nature is sinful, okay? And God wants us all to recognize that. That is that, no matter what you did today or what you did yesterday, whether you think you sinned or you didn't, we all must come to the realization that we are sinners. And I think we see in God's Word that in order for us to be able to enter into a right relationship with God, a covenant relationship with God, we have to do two things. Number one, we have to recognize God's nature, which is what? Which is holy. And we also have to recognize our own nature, which is what? Sinful. All right. God is holy. We are not holy. We are sinful in our very nature. And unless we start out at that point, we will never properly enter into a right relationship with God. And why is that? Well, if you don't believe that God is holy, you got a big problem, right? If you don't recognize that you are a sinner, you got a big problem. And that's one of the things that the Old Testament in particular shows us, and certainly the New Testament as well, is that no matter how hard the patriarchs tried, no matter how hard the nation of Israel tried to keep God's laws and to obey God's word, how often were they successful? Almost never. Demonstrating what? That they are sinful by nature. They were constantly committing sins, quote unquote, through ignorance, or committing sins unintentionally. And why is that? Well, they sin because they're sinners. That is just their nature. They can't help it. And we can't help it. But that's a very important point.
Would it have reference to, like us, if you're saved, you know Jesus and who he is, that we still continue to fall off to sin, and we're able to go back to him?
That's right. Well, we certainly do, and that's the whole point. I trust that all of us.
Theirs was a burnt offering, a different kind of offering, but that's the way they received their blessing and their salvation, I think.
Well, that's right. They received the blessing, the atonement, the forgiveness as a consequence of all of these offerings, all 5 of them together, right? And in essence, that's where we're ultimately going to wind up. After we finish our study, we're going to understand that Christ performed all of these, or he represents all of these offerings and what they represent and what they were intended to do for us. Because at the end of our study here, there's going to be a test. It's going to be a very difficult test, because we're all going to have to explain the significance in Christian terms of each one of these offerings: the whole burnt offering, the grain offering, the meal offering, the peace offering, and then the sin and the guilt offering. And I think we're going to see that they represent things that we know about what Christ did for us. We just need to make sure that we see the full depth of it. All right, so as we read chapter 4, we're going to see several things that are unique about the sin offering, but I want to pick up on one in particular that struck me. Some others may have stricken you, but let's get to it. Kathy, would you start and read again, starting with verse 2, and read from 2. One of the things I want you to see also, we talked about this last time. If you look in chapter 4, the sin offering, it's broken down to 4 different categories. Verse 3 says, if the appointed priest sins, then it tells you what to do. In verse 13, it says, if the whole congregation of Israel commits error, okay? Verse 22, it says, when a leader sins. And then in verse 27, it says, if the common people sin. So we have 4 categories here. We have the priest sins, we have the whole congregation sins, we have the leader sins, we have the common people sins. And there's something that is done in the context of all of those. So Kathy, if you would read about the anointed priest from verse 2 down to verse 12.
Tell the Israelites, when someone sins intentionally against any of the Lord's commands and does anything prohibited by them, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he is to present to the Lord a young, unblemished bull as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He must bring the bull to the entrance to the tent of the meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head and slaughter it before the Lord. The anointed priest must then take some of the bull's blood and bring it into the tent of meetings. The priest is to dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. The priest must apply some of the blood to the horns of the altar of fragrant incense that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. He must pour out the rest of the bull's blood at the base of the altar of burnt offerings, that is, at the entrance to the tent of meetings. He is to remove all the fat from the bull of the sin offering, the fat surrounding the entrails and all the fat that is on them, and the 2 kidneys with the fat on them at the loins. He will also remove the fatty lobe of the liver with the kidneys, just as the fat is removed from the ox of the fellowship sacrifice. The priest is to burn them on the altar of burnt offering. But the hide of the bull and all its flesh, with its head and shanks and its entrails and dome, and all the rest of the bull, he must bring to the ceremonially clean place outside the camp to the ash heap, and must burn it on a wood fire. It is to be burned at the ash heap. Now, if the whole...
Pause right there. All right, so Kathy just read to us about, this is the introduction to the sin offering. And there are several things about this. It sounds very much like the whole burnt offering in some respects, doesn't it? Because it starts off that you bring a bull. He shall bring the bull to the doorway of the tent, okay? What he's offered is a bull, which is a male without defect, and this is going to be the sin offering. And that's pretty much the same as the whole burnt offering, wasn't it? But then we see there's some different things that happen. What is similar? First of all, and I think this is very significant, that the one who brings it must lay his hands on the head of the sacrificial animal and kill it. That is the same as with the whole burnt offering. But I'll submit to you that even though this is the same, that there's a different significance to it. Because I believe that we'll see that when we compare the two, that is the whole burnt offering and the grain offering, which are sort of together with the sin offering and the guilt offering, the laying on of hands in the whole burnt offering is intended to signify how God through Christ imparts his righteousness to us. Okay, that's the laying on of the hands. We receive his righteousness in the whole burnt offering. Whereas in the sin offering, the laying on of the hands is intended to represent Christ taking our sins from us. That is, the transference of the sin from the one who brings the offering to the animal that is killed. Okay? The same act, but a different imputation, if you will. You see the difference there? And we see that excuse me, I think in some of the other differences here. So then what happens? Then the anointed priest is to take some of the blood of the bull and bring it to the tent of the meeting, and the priest will dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary, which is right here. Because we know that when an animal is killed, typically all the blood is going to be sprinkled around the altar of sacrifice. We saw that in the whole burnt offering. But then, and this is the interesting thing, it says in verse 7, the priest shall also put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense, which is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. That, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is unique in all the offerings. I believe this is the first blood that finds its way into the holy place and onto the horns of the altar of incense.
And where's the altar of incense?
The altar of incense is right here. This is the altar of sacrifice. This is the brazen altar. Remember, once you go in, on your left is the lampstand. On the right is the table of showbread. The veil is right in front of you, and of course behind the veil, that's the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat is. But right before the veil is the altar of incense. Okay? In this particular sacrifice, one of the unique aspects of it is that the blood is not solely sprinkled around the altar of sacrifice. Rather, a part of it is brought inside the holy place and placed upon the horns of the altar of incense. What is that all about? Remember what it is that the altar of incense was intended to remind the children of Israel about? Then we prepared a chart, and the chart, of course, has to be part of your final exam too. But one of the things that that God, I think, has shown in the layout of the tabernacle is a reminder of the history of the children of Israel. With the altar of sacrifice being what? Remind them of the...
Mount Sinai covenant.
No, the altar of sacrifice first.
Altar of sacrifice.
Was the Passover.
Yeah.
With me? All right. And then the brazen laver was what?
The Red Sea.
The Red Sea. And then the holy place here was to remind them of what?
The wilderness.
All right. The table of showbread was to remind them of?
The pillar of fire.
No.
No, table of showbread's the manna.
Manna in the wilderness. The golden lampstand was to remind them of?
The pillar of fire.
The pillar of fire that guided them. And then finally, the altar of incense was to remind them of what?
The Mount Sinai covenant.
Mount Sinai, that's right. Because it was always smoldering in the dark, if you will. What happened at Mount Sinai? Of course, we all remember that's where God actually spoke to the people. He made a covenant with them. He spoke to them. He said, thou shalt not. And the people responded with the covenant. It says, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So the altar of incense that's inside the holy place was to symbolize that particular aspect of Mount Sinai being, that is the place where the people entered into a covenant relationship with God. Now, in that context, does that help you to understand a little bit better the significance of, in this particular sacrifice, the requirement or the necessity of bringing a part of the blood and putting it on the horns of the altar of incense inside? What does that symbolize? What does that tell us about that particular sacrifice?
It's a renewal of the covenant. Because this is the priest.
Yep.
The priest just sinned here. And so in order for the whole temple to be clean, they have to be reminded of the sacrifice.
Right.
It has to go through all of the...
Not just a renewal of the covenant, but it is an essential element of the covenant, right?
Right.
And that is what's going on here. All of this particular sacrifice is to bring recognition to all the people of what we just discussed earlier, that I am a sinner. Okay? Not just that I have committed sins, but by my very nature, I am a sinner. And because of that, in order to deal with that particular defect in human beings, what we have in this symbolism here, that in order for us to enter into a right relationship, which is again symbolized by the altar of incense, that is what we must recognize our nature, just like we discussed before. Would you start saying, Lon?
Is this the same altar horns that they would go to, like when David died? Remember Solomon's brother went there for mercy?
Right.
Is that the same horns?
No, this is not the same place. Remember that
It's not the same altar.
not the same, not the same altar, but there really is a lot of the same symbolism there, because if you remember my pictures up on the wall, I had a picture of a stone altar, and it had the four horns on the outside. And during the time, I think of the judges, that they set up some sanctuary cities, right? So if somebody sinned, they could go to a sanctuary city, and they could grab onto the horns of the altar. And that was like when we used to play tag when we were kids. We say, this is base, all right? If you hold on to the horns of the altar, then nobody could come and kill you, right? It's sort of the same thing in a way, because the horns that were on the altar, the horns were symbolic of what? Of power. Like the horns of the bull, his power symbolized in the horns, and that's why the altar had horns, to symbolize the power. And so this is really kind of a manifestation of the power of God. And so clinging to the horns of the altar, the place of sacrifice, is in essence both a confession of sin of the one who clings, but also the power of God to what? To forgive and to protect. So yeah, they are very similar, but the place where the person would go would not be here, because nobody was permitted inside of the tabernacle. except the priest.
It would be the closest place that they could go to without death.
Without death?
Death. You know, because it, you know, every year, once a year, one of them went in, and if he wasn't clean.
Yeah, he went in back here.
Yeah, that's
The
what
Holy
I'm saying,
Holies, that's
but
right.
that is the closest place.
That's right.
that they could get to God
That's right.
and have the priest have his sins cleansed without death.
That's right.
Because if he went inside to try to do it,
That's right. If you took just one more step, that's right. Yeah. And don't you know that must have been an awesome and fearsome thing, because this was always like, it was like on fire. You know, the fire was always, the presence, you symbolize the presence of God was always in the holy of holy places. So just even to draw near to it would have driven many people to their knees, and I'm sure it did. All right. And then there's something else interesting here. We see that once this animal is slain, it's basically gutted, all right? Some of the blood is brought inside, but much of the blood is sprinkled around the altar of sacrifice. But then we see the kidneys are removed, the liver is removed, and the fat is removed, and all of that is then placed upon the altar of incense, okay? The rest of the carcass is not. The rest of the carcass is taken outside and is burned at a clean place, which is outside of the camp. First off, what is the significance of the gutting of the animal and placing just the kidneys and the liver and the fat, and only that being burned on the altar of sacrifice?
Is it the removal of the sin or the bad parts or
I think you're there. I think what it's having people recognize is that the nature of sin we're dealing with here, which is the sin nature, the fact that it's something that we all have, is not just external. It's internal. It's part of the internal organs, if you will. And so that particular part is extracted, and that's what's burned. You know, symbolically destroying that which causes the sin, which is what is in the midst of us. Now, I searched here to see why didn't they pull out the heart and put the heart on there. You'd think that would be more symbolic. But you know, back then it really wasn't the heart that they talked about. When they talked about the seat of emotions and whatever, sometimes they talk about the gut, but they always really more talk about the inward parts rather than symbolically the heart. And of course we know that the heart really is at the center of emotion. It is all of our internal parts, which are the center of our being. So I think that is symbolic. The taking of these things and putting them on the altar is symbolic of the human nature, that which makes a person live. That's being burned up. What about taking the rest of the carcass, including the skin, all of the flesh, and everything else outside of the camp to be burned? What is that a foreshadowing of?
crucifixion?
Yeah, because the New Testament tells us very specifically that where was Christ crucified? He was taken. He wasn't sacrificed in the temple or at the place where all the sacrifices were made. He was taken to the outside. His body was taken to the outside.
It also mentions burning on a wood fire.
Mm-hmm. Always burned. In this particular fire, it never went out. It was always kept stoked. The fire on the bronze.
On the outside?
Yeah, this particular fire right here.
No, I'm looking outside where they took the rest of it.
Oh, on the outside, yeah,
It
burned
says
with wood
it
fire. that's
fire, but it wasn't always burning, was it?
right. I don't think so.
Okay.
And the ash heap, the witnessing.
What'd you say, Brother Kenny?
A friend of mine had to have some surgery done on the kidney, and his kidney was covered with a fat.
Yeah.
And the doctor told him, said a lot of people have so much fat, even an x-ray, you can't see the organs in their body. The liver and the kidney in particular can be just covered with fat.
Interesting. Yeah.
Also, the kidneys and the liver, aren't they, don't they take impurities out of the
They're vital organs, yeah.
Vital organs. That's right. You can't live without them.
Purify,
They filter.
Yeah.
purify the body.
filter? That's the
Yeah.
filter.
That's exactly right. Purification aspect of the kidneys. That's right.
could it also be that when they take it outside, that sacrifice is for everybody?
That's part of it. That's part of it. And we're going to see here
It
that.
would end up, when Christ was crucified, it was for everyone,
Right.
not just the Jews.
right? For everybody to see, because
Priest.
you're right, that's a good point. Everybody could not see it when it was inside of here. If it was taken outside to be burned, yeah, that was, you know, a public spectacle. And that's exactly where Christ was crucified, at the place. They took him to a place where as many people as possible could see him.
The Wailing Wall that is now in use, does that wall there represent, the outside wall represent that? Because the people, common people weren't allowed in there.
That's true, and the reason why the Jews go to the Wailing Wall, and just so you know what the Wailing Wall is, the Wailing Wall was a permanent structure that was built by King Herod at Mount Moriah, where the temple was. Remember, after Solomon built his temple, it was destroyed, as we know, by the Babylonians, and then the temple was rebuilt by under whose auspices? Zerubbabel, that's right. After the children of Israel returned from the Babylonian captivity. And then, several hundred years after that, 500 years after that, 400 years, King Herod came along, and he decided to build something that would assist in worship. Yes, really, it was kind of a political stunt to ingratiate the people to him. What he did is he carved the stone mountain, and he basically took blocks and made basically defined a 40-acre area. Then he backfilled it with rubble and paved the top of it. So the porch would be basically at the same level as the temple, because you know the temple was built on a hill and it all sloped down. People would talk about going up to the temple. You know, Solomon wrote many psalms were written about the psalms of ascent, going up to the temple. Well, Herod sort of leveled the playing field. He created about a 40-acre plaza, if you will, to bring everything up. So you'd have to ascend to that, but then you could walk around on this 40 acres. The Wailing Wall is the western wall of the Temple Mount that Herod built. It wasn't actually a part of the old temple itself, right. But the Jews, you know, the strict Jews these days will not go up to the Temple Mount for fear that they would tread on the holy place, because it was forbidden for any Jew to go to the holy place. And since they don't know exactly where the temple was, they don't go up there. These are the strict Jews, and that's the reason they don't want to step on the holy place. But they do gather around the western wall, okay, which would be over on this side, okay, sort of the back of it. They get as close as they can to that wall, knowing that if they went any further over, they might be in danger of stepping on the holy place, but they get as close to that as they can so they can draw as near as they possibly can to the temple. But hadn't thought about that. Yeah, this back wall could be symbolic of the western wall, but of course we know that the Jews who gather there today for the purpose of worshiping have really missed the point, because the tabernacle and the temple were all to point us to the real temple, which is Jesus himself. That's right. He says, you destroy the temple, what he meant was this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days, right? He would resurrect it. So rather than worshiping at the western wall, the Jews really should be worshiping Christ. But they're still focused on
that's one of the problems. The Palestinians, the area they want, will take that away from the Jews.
Well, yeah, not only that, I don't know if you read about that recent UNESCO proclamation that would basically acknowledge that the Jews had nothing to do with the building of the temple or the Temple Mount. That was something that the Palestinians did. Give me a break. Or that was something that the Muslims did way back when.
So,
basically rewriting history is what they want to do.
Not to go chase a rabbit, but they're talking about Christ's tomb. Is that in the temple? Where is that at in Jerusalem? That the one, there's 2 sites, right? There's one by...
There's one that's called the tomb. I wish I had my maps here. There's one that's called the Tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that is almost due west of the Temple Mount, okay? It's not a far walk, but it's due west. The other one is called the Garden Tomb, and that's kind of northwest of the Temple Mount. Neither one of them are very far away.
Yeah, One of the guys I work with came back from Jerusalem or trip they went on. He was showing me pictures of the garden tomb, which he
Yeah.
said he believes that it really, you can see the skull.
Yeah,
I mean,
you really
you
can.
don't have to use your imagination to see
Right.
that, like that's where Christ was crucified. I mean, it looks like a man's face.
It really does, and I've got a
It's
picture of
outside
that.
the city walls.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not in all that.
Outside the city wall, and that garden tomb, I mean, the description of it, as one of the writers of the gospel said, it was a right-hand tomb. You walk in and the burial spot was to the right. That's just the way that is. And it appears to be on the property of a very wealthy man because they found a cistern, a man-made cistern that's down below it that'll hold, a couple 100,000 gallons of water. So it was obviously owned by somebody very wealthy like Joseph of Arimathea. And then, there's a good explanation. A lot of the historians say that no, the tomb that's at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is really the one because there's a lot of ancient writings that point to that being the spot where Christ was buried. But the answer to those who tell you about the garden tomb, they say, well, you know what? The people who wrote that knew that the Romans were coming into Jerusalem for the very purpose of destroying all the Christian relics and places of worship. And so they say that this place could have
They
been,
misdirected.
it was exactly, that's right, it was misdirection. They said, oh yeah, that's the place there. And the Romans did, they just leveled it. I mean, it took hundreds of years and a lot of excavation to find that place where everybody said, yeah, that's the spot where Jesus was crucified, that's where he was buried. And so, you can see that, yeah, through misdirection, they didn't want the Romans to destroy the very place which could have been the garden tomb. I don't know, There are good arguments in both directions. But I'll tell you what, I went to the garden, I went to both of them, and I want to believe that Christ rose in that garden tomb because it's such a beautiful place. It really is. And, it just, that feels right to me. Now, the other place, it's crowded, it's just absolute squalor. It's got some old dark buildings built over it. That may be the place, but again, the place really doesn't matter that much. The fact is, the important point is that he was crucified and he's risen. Okay, we got off track. Tom, you had a question? Or you forgot about it already?
No?
All right, go ahead.
What happened to this here?
What happened to that there? That tabernacle, I need to have my historians back me up on this, and we'll chase that rabbit track down. My recollection was the last place that the tabernacle was set up was outside of Jerusalem. I want to say, was it in Shiloh? We'll find that. I think it's in the book of Samuel. But it was set up, and then we ultimately know that David moved the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle to the temple after the temple, or into Jerusalem, I'm sorry.
Took this off of here?
No, he just took it. He just took this right here. Just the Ark of the Covenant out, and that was moved into Jerusalem. You remember they first tried to put it on an ox cart to carry it along, and the ox cart tilted over, a man reached out to touch it, he was stricken dead, and then everybody said, what's going on? And then they read, and they said, oh no, it needs to be carried by priests.
This was after Samuel, after the rats. Was that when they?
Well, there was a time, as we know, that when the Philistines attacked, and the
Yeah.
Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant, and they took it back and they put it in the temple of Dagon,
Right.
their god. And then, they got whelps all over them, and then at one point in time, the statue of Dagon fell over and broke into pieces.
So they put it in a good place for like 70 years or something. So that's where David went to get it?
Yeah. Well, no, it was eventually brought back. I think David took it from where it was. It was just north of Jerusalem.
Somebody's house.
And it was in somebody's house, and I want to say it was in Shiloh, but that may not be right. But I'll look that up. That's a good question. But as far as what happened to the rest of it, I don't think the Scripture tells us. I think it may have just fallen into disuse, whatever. We know, for example, some of the relics. For example, we read where even like 700 years later in Jerusalem, they still had the bronze serpent that Moses had constructed in the wilderness. And one of the kings said, no, we're going to destroy that. And it was, there's an account of its destruction. But I don't know that there's an account of the destruction of the tabernacle. I don't think there is. If anybody remembers it, let me know, and I'll look that up. But it's a good question. But we do know that this was moved, and this for a time was in the temple. But then when Solomon's temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, it just kind of disappeared, you know.
What kind of material was that made out of?
This was
That gold.
the mercy seat. This right here was solid gold, beaten gold. This right here was made out of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, solid gold. And then the poles here were acacia wood, overlaid with gold. And we remember what was inside of it? Tablets of the Ten Commandments,
Aaron's rod.
and the roll of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded. That's right.
You know, when Nebuchadnezzar came down, it seemed to me that would have been a really valuable thing for them, because they're looking at it as gold.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of gold. Remember we talked before, there's like $40 billion worth of gold, you know, in the tabernacle, and there probably was more than that in the temple. I think all the valuable stuff from the tabernacle was moved into the temple.
That was the
What's that?
I'd say a lot of that was never going to rot.
Oh, that's right.
Material.
That's right.
So that you think,
Yeah.
well, yeah, a lot of people wondered where that actually wound up, you know?
Yeah.
Was it burnt? I mean, was it melted back, or would God let that happen?
Yeah, you know, I suspect there was a lot of gold and silver in the new temple that Solomon built, and I suspect that probably the gold and silver that went into the temple came from the tabernacle. I don't know if it says specifically, but I would think that it was. And perhaps, you know, some of these, the skins that covered the top of it were incorporated into the veils that were brought into the temple. Now we know that the temple would have had an actual roof on it, but it did have veils in it, several veils. So they probably recycled a lot of that stuff, would be my guess. But tremendous day. But we also remember, since we're talking history, that I think it was in the time of Hezekiah, that the Babylonians came over, and Hezekiah says, look at all my treasures.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was Isaiah was saying, you idiot, these guys are coming back. Yeah. And guess what? They did come back.
They opened up and said, look what I got in my safe.
That's right. Exactly. Isaiah said, you're an idiot. And, you know, and the Babylonians came back. I'm sure that they kept notes, and they came back several hundred years later. All right, what are y'all talking about?
The ark, yeah,
There was, I think the last place that it was set up was at Mizpah.
Mizpah?
That's where Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord
Okay.
before Saul became the king.
Okay. So yeah, there was a couple of places where the site of worship was set up at the time of Samuel. But we'll track that down. It's an interesting question. But again, nobody knows except Indiana Jones what happened to the ark. So
There were four or five different places.
that's right.
I have another chart.
Okay.
I'd
You need-
hate to have been the first man that went there and went to tear that down, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Well, you know, again, I don't know that it's recorded, but you know, we're going to read later on about when they decamped, so to speak. They had specific rules about who was to do what. Specific tribes would take down the outer tent. Specific tribes would take this. A specific tribe would take that. And so I suspect that when they transitioned from the tabernacle to the temple, that probably those same families had, you know, were involved in the transport of these various things into the
If each
temple.
tribe had a certain thing, then they take those pieces and they had to transport them to the next place.
That's right.
So I guess they just kept them in their possession, probably.
Probably right.
I mean,
Probably
there
so.
wasn't no sense in stockpiling, and they had to go figure it all out.
You're right.
That's right. That's exactly right. Okay, let's read a little bit more. Okay, we went down to verse 13. Who's next? Is that you, Jackie?
If the whole Israelite community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though the community is unaware of the matter, they are guilty. When they become aware of the sin they committed, the assembly must bring a young bull as a sin offering and present it before the tent of meeting. The elders of the community are to lay hands on the bull's head before the Lord, and the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. Then the anointed priest is to take some of the bull's blood into the tent of meeting. He shall dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle it before the Lord 7 times in front of the curtain. He is to put some of the blood on the horns of the altar that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting.
The rest of the blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering and at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He shall remove all the fat from it and burn it on the altar. And do this with this bull, just as he did with the bull for the sin offering. In this way, the priest will make an atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. Then he shall take the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned the first bull. This is the sin offering for the community.
All right. This is very similar to what Kathy read earlier about the sin offering for the anointed priest, which again I think was to represent the group. Then we have some more specifics about the whole congregation. One of the things that we see here that we're going to see that's repeated in verse 20, so the priest shall make atonement for them, and they shall be forgiven. You know, that is an essential element of this sin offering, and that is the forgiveness aspect. And it's forgiveness of not a specific sin, but it is forgiveness that comes from the recognition from the offeror that I am a sinner, that I have committed sins, even if I don't know what they were, even if they're unintentional. It is a recognition, it is a sacrifice made in recognition of my nature, that I am a sinner. We're going to see later on there's another guilt offering that's given for specific sins that you know you've committed, but this is basically an offering that's given in recognition of my nature, my sinful nature. And that's a very important aspect of our relationship with God. All right, starting with verse 22. This is if the leader sins. Want to read that, please?
When a leader sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the commands of the Lord his God, he is guilty. When he is made aware of the sin he committed, he must bring as his offering a male goat without defect. He is to lay his hand on the goat's head and slaughter it at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered before the Lord. It is a sin offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall burn all the fat on the altar as he burned the fat of the fellowship offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for the man's sin, and he will be forgiven.
Pause right there. Again, that line, very important. He shall be forgiven. What's different about this, the sin of the leader, how is that dealt with?
His offering is a male goat.
Male goat. Now you think, now that's strange. Seems like we're down. We start off with a bull or a bullock, a young bull, which is a very valuable animal. Now we kind of step down a little bit to a goat. What do you think the reason for that is?
I was going to ask you another question.
Go ahead.
But I was just going to say, what do you think the reason they even go from the priest, the leader, the community? Is it just to say that you're not in a position where you're above sin, that all is guilty? You know what I mean? Somebody like say, well, I was in command, so I'm not being accountable for that or something.
I think you're right. I think it is to say, number one, that all have sinned. We're taking it at every level. We say the anointed priest, the whole congregation, the leader, and finally, verse 27, we get to the common people. So nobody's excluded, right? Mm-hmm. But then we're also going to see that the offering, the sin offering, is kind of stepped down. We're going to see it starts with a bull, it goes to a goat, and then it goes even a little bit lower.
Is what they can afford?
Exactly. That nobody is going to be excluded from making the sin offering and getting the forgiveness on account of their financial well-being, if you will. So I think that's exactly right. First, yes, ma'am.
Also, the reason the priest would have to make theirs first, their offering first, is so that they could make the offering for the rest of the people.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, the priest starts out, he's a sinner, and then the whole congregation, and then the leader. This is the secular leader, if you will, kind of the leader of the tribe. He does it, and then finally it's the common people. Whosoever will, so to speak, right? 27, Brother King, would you read that? We're just about time. Let's just do that, and then we'll call time out.
If a member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, he is guilty. When he is made aware of the sin he committed, he must bring as his offering for the sin he committed a female goat without defect. He must lay his hands on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering Then the priest is to take some of the blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all the fat. This is the fat is removed from the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. In this way the priest will make atonement for him, and he will be forgiven.
And he will be forgiven. Again, that's repeated. And we see also at the very end of this chapter that he shall be forgiven. All right, what is the difference in the offering that Kenny just described? How is it different from the one that Wanda described?
The blood is put on the
No, this one is a female goat.
Yeah.
female goat. Yeah.
So we go from a male goat, the most valuable of animals probably, to a male goat and now a female goat, which is again more common, less valuable than the male goat was. But again, I think the reason is for the purpose that we discussed before, that nobody would be excluded. Now Jackie says we're out of time, so next time
Well,
we're going to finish.
like in where each one of them says, in this way, the priest, and I want to put that a capital P, will make atonement for him and he will be forgiven. And it's repeated so many times.
That's right, and that's telling us about what Christ did and how what he did is basically a fulfillment of all these.